Good day to everyone. For this discussion, we will talk about the concept of communication, particularly its process, elements, and form. Our objectives are as follows. Number one, to be able to understand the process of communication. Number two, to be able to discuss the elements of communication and their roles in the communication process. Number three, to identify the different forms of communication. Number four, to be able to emphasize the functions of communication to the life of an individual and to be able to have realizations on the importance of communication to people. Previously, the basic or simple definition of communication was presented. It was said that communication is the act or process of sending and receiving of message through a chosen channel. This implies that in order to have successful communication, a correct, appropriate, or effective communication process should take place. Always remember that communication is a process and it takes place when people convey and exchange idea, information, insight, feelings, emotions, values, and or belief with each other. Let's focus on the 11th principle of communication. Communication is a process. So the communication process refers to the step-by-step process on how communication takes place between the sender and the receiver. It can be said that communication is dynamic because it varies from person to person or to the situation. Take note that if there is an effective and successful communication process, there will be understanding. The sender and the receiver of the message will understand each other. Let's take a look at the illustrated process of communication. So in the communication process, there should be a sender who will send or transmit a message to the receiver through a chosen channel. Okay, the sender and receiver for this part will change role. So the receiver will then be the sender of the message and he or she will give a feedback based on the interpreted or received message. So here, the sender will become the receiver of the feedback given. Take note that if the communication process is not successful, it might be because of a certain barrier commonly called as the noise. But if there's no barrier in between the communication process, it will become successful and effective. If there is a noise or barrier in the middle, it will become unsuccessful and ineffective. Okay, let's discuss the elements involved in the communication process. What are those elements? First is the sender. Second is the message. Third is the receiver. Fourth is the channel. Fifth is the feedback. And we will also talk about the noise or the barrier. First element, the sender. The sender is an individual or group or organization who initiates the communication, meaning the sender is the source of the information or the location where the message were from. Okay, sender encodes the message that will be transmitted, and the sender transmits the message by converting his or her thoughts into symbols or observable signals. So the symbols or signals may be in the form of language, words, gestures, facial expression, and body language. All of this can be used in transmitting the message. Or the second element, the message. The message or the messages are the ideas or thoughts that are transmitted from the sender to receiver. They are usually transmitted with symbols and or observable signals. Again, what are the symbols or observable signals that may be used in sending the message? These are the language, the words, the gestures, the facial expression, and or the body language. And the third element, the receiver. This is the destination of the message. The receiver will be the one to receive the message. So the receiver is an individual or individuals to whom the message is directed, transmitted, delivered or conveyed. The receiver decodes or interpret the message that will be received, and once the message is received and interpreted correctly, successful communication occurs. So the interpretation is influenced by experiences, attitude, knowledge, skills, perception, and culture. This is related to the principle of communication about communication is an interpretative act. By interpretative act, why? Because the receiver will be the one who will interpret the message, or the receiver will be the one to decode the message, and the message will be interpreted based on the receiver's perception or receiver's interpretation. Okay. Once the message is received and interpreted correctly, successful communication will occur. Here, this one, third bullet. And the interpretation of message is influenced by, again, the experiences of the receiver, the attitude of the receiver, the knowledge of the receiver, skill of the receiver, perception of the receiver, and or culture of the receiver. This pertains to the principle of communication, which is all about schemata-driven. Schemata-driven is about the prior experiences, diba? Prior experiences or past experiences, knowledge or skill about the message received. That's why for the receiver, the principles of communication that were applied are the principle of communication about schemata-driven and interpretative act. Okay. For the fourth element, the channel or the medium, this is also known as the medium of communication. It is the method used to deliver the message. It may be in a form of oral or written, but using technologies nowadays can be a great help. So can be oral or written or using technology, because technology can be a great help in the communication process. So there are different examples of channels, the medium through which the message is sent. The use of the five senses, the sense of sight, the visual signals, the sense of hearing, the audio signals, the sense of taste, the sense of smell, and the sense of touch, the haptics. So the use of devices and technology can be also used in the communication process. Like, for example, the telephone. This is used in a two-way process or two-way communication process because the sender and receiver can communicate with each other. They can change roles. The sender will become the receiver will become the sender. So there is a cycle between the sender and receiver in terms of the communication process. For the radio, this is used for one-way communication process only. Why one way? Because the sender can send the message to the receiver, but the receiver cannot give any feedback towards the sender. Because it's not like the telephone, that the telephone is used in giving feedback or giving replies. For the radio, it is merely on the one-way communication process. Another example is the use of the laptop, the cell phone, and the screen or monitor or television. So here, the laptop was used for communication process or communication purposes also. This is used for two-way communication process because the sender and the receiver can converse or can communicate with each other real time. There is a sending of message, there is a receiving of message, there is a changing of roles between the sender and the receiver. Likewise with this, the cell phone, this is the sender, this is the receiver. They can converse, they can communicate with each other through the device, the cell phone. This is used also in a two-way communication process. Screen, monitor, or television, like for example, the virtual classes or during meetings, we use a device so that we can communicate with each other. It can be used in a two-way process or one-way process only. Okay, for the one-way process, the sender can send the message to the receiver, but the receiver cannot give any reply or feedback. But that is also considered as a communication process. For the two-way communication process, the sender and the receiver can exchange messages, can converse, can communicate with each other quickly and real time using the technology, the internet, and the devices. So these are examples of channels or medium through which the message is sent. Let's go to the fifth element, the feedback. The feedback is given by the receiver in response to the message given by the sender. The feedback is the message transmitted by the receiver in response to the message of the speaker. It is a key element of the communication process since it allows the sender to review the effectiveness of the message. Examples of feedback are written or spoken comments, a smile, a nod, a thumbs up, and others. So take note for the feedback, we can use language, facial expression, body language, hand gestures, and other forms of feedback. Okay? Feedback may be in a form of, again, written or oral language, nonverbal or verbal messages or communication. Let's have the noise or the barrier. The noise is a common barrier in the communication because it distorts the message by interfering with the process or with the communication. So there are several barriers like language barrier, physical barriers, emotional barriers, social barriers, psychological barriers, and others. For the language barrier, it pertains to the use of the language or words by the sender and receiver that may cause hindrance in the communication process. Example, if the sender used a language that the receiver is not familiar with, there will become a language barrier. They cannot understand each other. For the physical barriers, this is about the distance of the sender to the receiver. If the distance is very far, they cannot understand each other also. The communication process will become ineffective and unsuccessful. For the emotional barrier, if one of the elements, like for example, the receiver is very emotional, the sender, even if the sender send a message to the receiver will not successfully receive the message because there's a barrier called emotion or emotional barrier. Social barrier, this is about the relationship of the sender and the receiver in the aspect of social or in the society. Psychological, this is about the cognitive aspect of a person. If the receiver cannot understand the message of the sender because the receiver doesn't have any prior experiences or knowledge about the message being talked about, there will be a barrier in the communication process. The communication process will become or will not become successful or effective. Okay, these are the elements involved in the communication process. So again, I'll just go back to this illustration. Okay, the sender encodes the message to be transmitted to the receiver through a chosen channel. When the communication is successful, the receiver will be able to receive the message and he or she will interpret the message by decoding. After the interpretation, the receiver will become the sender who will send a feedback to the former sender. The sender here will become the receiver of the message. Okay. So this is sender to receiver, sender to receiver, sender to receiver, sender to receiver. So it will become successful if a channel is used in transmitting the message. If there's a barrier in the middle, it will become ineffective or unsuccessful. So the communication process will not become successful if there is a barrier. Okay, remember this. Here is the simple presentation of the communication process. Did you know that communication have different forms? So before the forms, let's have the process of communication. Okay, here this is the sender, this is the receiver, this is the channel, the feedback, and then the noise. Okay, the sender is the one who will encode the message, who will formulate a message. After formulating the message, the sender will choose a channel to be used in transmitting the message. And after choosing the channel, after using the channel that has been chosen, the message will be transmitted to the receiver. The receiver should be able to receive the message, and after receiving the message, the receiver should decode the message. After decoding, there will be changing of roles between sender and receiver. The receiver will become the sender. So the receiver will encode a message in response to the message received. How will be the encoding? Okay, the encoding based on the interpretation of the receiver. Okay, after the interpretation, the receiver will encode the message and it will be transmitted through a feedback. But before the message will be transmitted, the receiver should also choose a channel to be used in sending the feedback. After choosing the correct or appropriate channel, the receiver can already send the feedback to the former sender, but in here, the sender will become the receiver. And if the former sender is the receiver in this case, he or she should decode the message. So the cycle goes on. Sender to receiver, sender to receiver, sender to receiver, sender to receiver. If there's no barrier in the middle, such as noise, the communication process will become successful. If there is a noise in the middle of the interaction or in the communication process, it will become unsuccessful or ineffective. Another illustration, this is the same as the first and second illustration, but I will just give a brief explanation about this. Basic model of communication, the communication cycle, sender, receiver, sender encodes a message and it should be transmitted to the receiver through a chosen channel. So what are the different channels that you may use? Face-to-face, video, telephone, speech, voicemail, online, email, letters, bulletins, media, and others. So after choosing a channel, the message will be transmitted to the receiver. The receiver will decode the message through interpretation. After interpretation, the receiver will encode a message in response to the message received. And after encoding, the receiver should choose again another channel to be used in sending the feedback. After successful implementation of the channel, the receiver can already send the feedback to the former sender, who will then become the receiver in this case. Okay, the receiver will decode the message, and after that, the receiver will encode another message. So the cycle goes on. Sender to receiver, sender to receiver, sender to receiver, sender to receiver. That is the basic model of communication. If there's no noise in the middle or barrier in the middle of the communication process will become successful and effective. But if there is a barrier or noise in the middle of the conversation or communication, the communication will become ineffective or unsuccessful. So that is the process of communication. Okay, did you know that communication have different forms? So there are different forms of communication that can be considered when sending and receiving of message. First form is the intrapersonal form of communication. If we say intrapersonal, from the prefix intra, meaning within, personal, meaning oneself. So communicating within one's self. The self is the source, the self is the receiver. How would that be? During meditation, analysis, thinking, studying, and talking to oneself. If you meditate, if you analyze something, if you are thinking about something, if you're studying, sometimes you tend to talk to yourself. You are the source of the information, you are the receiver of the information. So the communication will become intrapersonal, communicating within oneself. Second form of communication, dyadic. Dyadic form of communication composed of two people conversing. Two people conversing to establish, or the goal of dyadic form of communication is to establish, maintain, restore, and or end a relationship. So what are the different channel or medium to be used, or that can be used in the dyadic form of communication? The telephone, the SMS, the face-to-face conversation. Telephone, two-way communication, SMS, two-way din yan. And then for the face-to-face, it is also two-way process. Kaya sinabing dyadic, two people conversing. Okay? So in this illustration, there is a sender and the receiver. So the sender is the source of the information, the receiver is the receiver of the information, and there will be changing of roles between the sender and the receiver. After the receiver receives the message of the sender, the receiver will become the source of the message, and he or she will give feedback. So cyclical yan. That's why dyadic, or two people conversing ang ibig sabihin ng dyadic form of communication. Third form of communication, the small group communication. Small group, this is composed of 3 or more persons involved. The goal is to solve problems. What situations can we give as an example for this small group? During conferences or meetings. Also during group works in the face-to-face classes. Okay, for the conferences, it is composed of 3 or more persons involved. Okay, also with the meetings and group works in the face-to-face classes, diba? So here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there are 5 persons involved in the small group. Each of them can be the receiver or the source of the information. For example, this is the sender. All of this will become the receiver. But if this would become the sender of the message, this will become the receiver of the message. So each of them can be the receiver or the source of the message. In the group works, in the face-to-face classes, the goal is not merely to solve problems, but to accomplish a task or accomplish an activity. Okay, that is a small group. That's why if the teacher is giving group works, the small group communication or small group should contain 3 or more persons involved. It should not be 2. Kasi if it is 2 or the person involved in the group is 2, it's not a small group. It is a dyadic or pair work na yun. So small group composed of 3 or more persons involved to solve problems. Okay, that is the third form of communication. Let's have the fourth form of communication, the public form of communication. This happens between one and several other people, meaning one sender, several other people as the receivers. The goal of this is to inform, to persuade, and to entertain. So there is a sender and receivers in one place or in a crowd. This is a one-way communication process since the sender gives or send a message to the receivers, but the receivers cannot give direct feedback to the sender because of their numbers. So plenty or numerous or several receivers is to one sender. That's why it will become impossible for the feedback to happen. That's why ang public communication or public form of communication is considered a one-way communication process. This is done again to inform, to persuade, and to entertain. Example of this is during elections. The sender is the candidate for the election, and the receivers are the members of the society or members in the country. During SONA of the president is the sender, the receivers are the ones who are listening to the speech. During public speeches in the school activities, there is a sender and multiple receivers. During graduation, the valedictory address, the valedictorian says deliver the speech about the valedictory address, and the receivers are the co-graduates. And sometimes in the face-to-face classes, the lecture mode, face-to-face classes or in a mass in the church during Sundays, diba? There is one sender and multiple receivers also. Okay, that is the public form of communication. Next is the mass communication. To communicate to an extremely large audience using audio and visual means. Okay, extremely large audience, meaning the audience are from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, or in different places, not in a crowd. It's not like the public communication that the sender and the receiver is in one place only. But for mass communication, the sender is in a particular location and the audience or receivers are from different locations also. So they can, the communication can be transmitted to the receivers through audio or visual means, or audio and visual means. Okay, the goal is the same as the public communication: to inform, to persuade, and to entertain. So examples of medias are television, radio, newspapers, recordings, movies also, magazines, comics, billboards, computers, and internet, and other forms of media. Lastly, for the forms of communication, the intercultural communication. This is communicating with another person or group of people coming from a background or community who does not share the same belief, traditions, symbolisms, or values. This is culture A, culture B. Culture A has its own communication process, has its own belief, tradition, symbolisms, or values. Also with culture B, it has its own belief, tradition, symbolism, or values. They can communicate with each other, but the topic is not about the belief, tradition, symbolism, or values. It can be about other information, but not this. Because if they will talk about the belief, tradition, symbolisms, or values, there will become conflicts. Ano yung conflict na yon? That is what we call the cultural barrier. Because of the differences between the culture A and culture B, they will not understand each other because of their differences. That's why for the intercultural communication, they can communicate with each other, but the topic is not about this, the belief, tradition, symbolism, or values. So these are the forms of communication. What are the functions of communication to people and to society? First function or basic function of communication is for interaction. Basically, this is for the day-to-day communication to build relationship, connection, or conversation with each other. Next, basic function is to increase our stored information from short-term to long-term memory. And if this is your information only about a certain matter, it can be increased. It can be changed. May mga additional din na madadagdag. May mga additional din na mailalagay or maisasama sa information nyo para magkaroon ng increased stored information. Third basic function is to understand ourselves and the world in which we live in, to know things around us, why it is happening, and what are the reasons why those situations are happening. And fourth basic functions of communication, to change people's attitudes, beliefs, opinions, and actions, for modification of the modifications of the attitude or personality, for discipline, for knowledge, and others. And lastly, for making decisions to help us decide on what to do to a certain problem and how to solve it. What is the importance of communication to the life of an individual? Okay, the first importance is communication to an individual is a means for his or her survival, because every person needs to communicate with other person in order for him or her to survive. If a person wants to buy something, if the person wants to inquire something about the enrollment, if the person wants to know the answer for this question, he or she needs to communicate with others so that he or she can get information about the queries or the concerns being asked. And number two, communication is used by people to learn things around them. So the communication is used by people not only to get information, but also to be entertained, to be informed, to be convinced, or to be persuaded about something. Okay, number three, communication is important to the workplace or to one's job to create unity, eliminate problems, promote better performance. Isn't it that in the workplace, we cannot avoid any problem? That's why if there will be a problem that will occur, the problem should be solved immediately. How? By using communication. If we use communication, we can create unity. We eliminate those problems. We can promote better performance. Number four, communication is significant in the family because it enables the members to express their affection towards each other. Yes, of course. We express our feelings and emotion, ideas, and belief through communication. How will others understand us if we cannot, or if we don't want to communicate, or if we cannot communicate with them, diba? If we cannot express ourselves. So for this situation, if we cannot communicate with other people, if we are shy, or if we cannot express our affection towards other person, there will be a misunderstanding or miscommunication. That's why all of us should use communication properly and appropriately. Number five, or the fifth importance, communication is essential in building relationship since it allows the individual to explain his or her needs and what he or she is experiencing towards the other person. Okay, if you want to tell the person you love him or her, if you want to explain your side because the person misunderstood you, or if you want to give information about something, you need to use communication also, so that the person will understand your side. Okay, these are the importance of communication to the life of an individual. Okay, for this afternoon, we have discussed 5 topics. Thank you for listening. Thank you for attending. Thank you for joining our virtual class. See you again next week. Thank you and goodbye.